The third major figure here that's important, especially as we're thinking towards the 18th century, the American Revolution, separation of church and state in the United States and in Europe as well, is John Locke. But Locke was the son of a country attorney, had undergone a classical education, and was very interested in medicine and experimental sciences. And so a lot of his notions towards philosophy are shaped by his interest in experimentation. Locke was probably heavily influenced by Puritanism, which we'll say more about in a little bit, but wasn't technically a Puritan. But he eventually, too, becomes interested in political philosophy, and his interest in political philosophy also has religious consequences as well. For Locke, our ideas come from perception. Okay? So instead of rationalism like Descartes was promoting, Locke is connected with what's often termed empiricism. And so we have this understanding of the world as we encounter it through our senses. And that is what provides us ideas. We encounter the world of our senses and then come up with ideas, as opposed to having ideas born in us. Which allowed some people to reject the idea of original sin. A very important concept in Catholicism and in a lot of Protestant groups, this notion that the sin of Adam and Eve was passed down to all human beings, so that human beings were born sinful. Well, Locke, of course, is kind of providing the foundation to deny that by saying we're not born with innate ideas or innate proclivity towards sin. Now, Locke himself still thought of humanity as a fallen creation, and so he still thinks of himself as Christian. But one of the things that he began to emphasize as well is that reason and judgment must be used to examine faith. So he too, like Descartes, is providing the foundation to say, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it should be accepted. It must be judged through the reason. Because of that, Locke also pushed for religious toleration. He was opposed to any sort of fanaticism and said that the state should not limit the freedom of religion because that decision is a personal decision. Here too, the church should only persuade, not coerce. So Locke is providing the foundation for modern notions of separation of church and state. And the church should only have persuasive power, right? Appeal to people and try to persuade them to the truths of Christianity versus getting the state involved. And the state shouldn't be involved in how a person decides to be religious or not. A lot of the thinking that will form the foundation for the Declaration of Independence, other of those founding United States documents, come from Locke. He talks about social contracts, the consent of the governed. And for him, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of property versus life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the way Jefferson will change some of Locke's ideas. And so philosophically here, we have these three thinkers who are going to have a tremendous impact politically, but are also providing a foundation, even though several of them are coming from this as Christians, are providing a foundation for the challenging of Christianity, the challenging of the truth of Christianity. And that especially also happens as we think about the development in the 17th century of science. Now we're getting more into what we think of as more modern science. And probably the key to understanding science in the 17th century is Galileo Galilei. Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy, very influenced by the work of Copernicus, which we talked about during the time of the Reformation, and of course extended it. Now Copernicus, of course, had postulated that the universe was heliocentric, it goes around the sun, And Galileo confirmed Copernicus' findings with the use of the telescope. But because of that, he is condemned by the Inquisition, because this is a challenging of church doctrine. Galileo is also known as the founder of modern physics, so he has a lot of impact scientifically. But his findings related to scientific discoveries made him question whether the church's hierarchy had the ability to evaluate scientific matters, because they were willing to stand against scientific discoveries like the heliocentric nature of the universe. And so he feels that the church doesn't have the right to make decisions about science, that there is something to be distinct about scientific inquiry and discovery. He is prohibited by the church, the Catholic Church, from writing or speaking about his discoveries. He's eventually placed under house arrest because he continued to promote his discoveries. Things went a little bit differently for the Englishman Francis Bacon. Bacon in England, right, so England's Protestant. Italy, of course, very Catholic, so there's a lot of focus of the church on science in Italy. Not as much in England. Bacon's concern, however, is wanting to find and create a new approach for scientific discovery. He wants to find a new method for investigating facts and then developing theories out of them, trying to understand the world, but doing it through this kind of empirical observation. Largely, previous generations of what we would call scientists, even though they weren't scientists in the strictly modern sense, previous generations had developed theories and then sought facts to uphold them or disprove them. Largely what we might call deductive reasoning. Bacon, on the other hand, said, no, you need to do inductive reasoning. So you gather facts, and then out of those facts, you develop laws, principles, or theories. Now, Bacon becomes important scientifically because a lot of people start adopting this to discover things about the world. But he's also important theologically because a lot of Reformed Protestants, especially Puritans, become fascinated with Bacon's approach, especially applying it towards Scripture. Additionally, and we'll talk more about that in the 19th century, additionally, one of the things that they combine Bacon's ideas with is their notion of human beings' dominion over nature. And one of the things, of course, in the Genesis account toward the end of chapter 1 is, they have dominion over nature. And so human beings, the Puritans thought, are tasked with improving nature. And so there's the emphasis on developing technologies, controlling nature, bringing it under human power. And so as Christians understood and conquered nature through Baconianism, the Puritans thought, they come closer to inaugurating the kingdom of God, right? Controlling the world, controlling society. Now, largely, of course, this approach that emphasizes dominion over nature versus stewardship over nature is one that continues to be a case, and some people have made the argument, which a lot of people find effective, that this mindset has largely impacted why, in Western culture, we have brought about such environmental issues because of this position of having dominion over nature, instead of understanding it as a stewardship God has given to human beings. What questions do you have about philosophy or science as it's changing in this 17th century period? Let's move on then to talk about other elements of culture that are being influenced by Christianity, but also are influencing Christianity as well. And so we'll be talking here about art, music, and literature. Continuing from the Renaissance, of course, there are these continued changes in these three areas as we look towards the modern period. Often a lot of art and literature had religious subjects at its heart or had very important theological backgrounds. And so a lot of Christians are involved in creating new art, creating new music, creating new literature. And of course, a lot of the things from this time period are still considered Western classics. But one of the things that's important in thinking about art in the 17th century is how influenced it is by Catholicism, especially in Europe. In the wake of the Protestant and Catholic reforms, the Catholic leadership became very active in commissioning art to remind common Catholics of the truth of Catholicism, but also of Catholicism's splendor, its majesty. And throughout the 17th century, very powerful popes encouraged and guided art and architecture, as they had been doing in previous centuries as well. But one of the things that was emphasized by these Catholic bishops and the Pope was that these works of art were to be clear and direct, easily understood by the common people, as it emphasized teachings of Christianity, as it emphasized the stories of Christianity and the splendor of Catholicism. Essentially, this was an emphasis on the church triumphant, the Catholic Church triumphant over Protestantism, which of course it wasn't. But this notion of the majesty. And so a lot of the things that were emphasized in this Catholic art of the time was this kind of material splendor and glory. And this was reflected not only in the art of the time, but in the architecture as well, with these majestic buildings filled with luxurious art, but then also gold, silver objects, precious stone, these huge ceilings with artwork on them. A lot of the art and the music of this time period is referred to as Baroque because it emphasized this complexity, notions of drama and opulence, but also emphasized the emotions. A lot of the Baroque artists, especially, were concerned with the beginnings of what we might call psychology. And so artists approached their subjects, the biblical stories they were painting, or individuals they were painting, and thinking about what is it these people are feeling at this point and why. And so you have this focus on splendor on the one side, you have a focus on the realism or the grit of life on the other, even while using religious subjects. When it comes to Protestantism, however, and thinking about Protestant approaches to art and architecture, many Protestants favored a stripping down of worship spaces. And so they didn't really encourage much artistic approaches to religious buildings, to church buildings. And so if you compare, even today, in today's time, you see more artwork in Protestant spaces. But even today, there is kind of this simplicity in Protestantism that is different from the cathedrals of Catholicism. A lot of that had to do with the Protestant emphasis on the Word. And so the emphasis was on things like the sermon, the intellect, the intellectual expression of the Word. And so those kind of things triumphed over artistic endeavors, at least in the church building. And so a lot of Protestant artists focused on secular subjects, scenes of everyday life, portraits, landscapes. There's not, you still have, of course, religious artwork, but not in church buildings, other types of religious types of spaces. With music, as well as with art, there is this transition that is occurring as well. Something that had been going on since the Renaissance but is really hitting its stride now in the 17th century. And that is this focus on making either the art or the music accessible outside of the worship service. And so music especially became more about the pleasure of the listener and not solely for the glory of God. A lot of Protestant and Catholic composers still emphasized that what they were doing was for the glory of God. But it was also about, is this pleasing to the ears of the person listening to it? And there's also this desire to make church music accessible to people separate and apart from churches. And so religious music in a more, in a non-religious context, so to speak. Additionally, there was a growing demand for secular music, music that wasn't necessarily created for a worship service, or that had a focus of worshiping God as its kind of main point, but music that could be used in the home that had no religious connotations to that. More and more people are starting to ask for that as kings and nobles commission works from composers, as composers themselves decide what they want to do with their music. One example of this developed throughout the 17th century is the growth of opera. Opera really kind of developing in the 17th century and developing as the multitude of musical voices and musical instrumentation was reduced to this kind of singularity, a single voice line with a simple instrumentation. Because it was felt that the very complex music of previous generations was too hard for people to understand. And so it became much more about simple vocal lines and simple instrumentation, which might sound odd to us, because when you think about opera to a lot of people is so complicated. It's hard to understand because it's in these other languages. Not so, of course, for the common people and the aristocrats, especially in the 17th century. Early opera drew from religious subjects, but drew a lot from Greek and Roman myths. And so these recreations, these dramatizations of Greek and Roman myths. Additionally to opera, of course, the public performance of religious works became popular as well. So performing a work that had a religious subject at its heart, but not in a church building, in a concert hall or in other settings. Works on Solomon, Job, Jesus, the Psalms. But set in a situation of entertainment, not worship. Very important in this 17th century, and really it's difficult to place him because he does a lot of work in the 18th century as well, of course, is Johann Sebastian Bach. Born in Germany toward the end of the 17th century, his parents died at the age of 10, and he was brought up by his older brother. A Lutheran, a lot of his focus on music was on glorifying God. But during his lifetime, and shortly after, he was little known, and it really wasn't until the 19th century that he really becomes a popular figure. Many of his pieces were expressions of his faith. And a lot of his writings were meant to be performed in churches throughout the year. But he also lived a life of a lot of struggles. His first wife died. Three children died in infancy. He would have a total of 20 children, right? So that brings a struggle of economic tension. His eyesight deteriorated later in life because of he was copying out of manuscripts. And so with how much he was working and composing, his eyesight got to the point where it was very bad. A doctor suggested an operation to help with that. The operation left him blind. So it was supposed to help his eyesight, it took it completely away. He eventually did recover his eyesight several months after this operation, only to die of a stroke 10 days later. But of course, this combining of religious music, secular settings, and how a lot of people today think of Bach not so much in religious settings, but in secular settings. Questions about any of those areas? So we're seeing kind of these new styles developing, new genres developing, but also this divorce between these objects and the church. There's still a lot of Christian influence here, but there are composers, artists, writers, that we'll talk about here in a minute, who are kind of slowly separating, even though they're not maybe intentionally doing it, slowly separating their works from a church context.